So hi, welcome to SCAI's Conversation in Interventional Cardiology. My name is Daniel Chamié. I'm an assistant professor of medicine of the cardiovascular medicine department at Yale University and the director of intravascular imaging and physiology core laboratories at Yale Cardiovascular Research Group and the JSCAI editor section editor for the imaging and physiology in focus of JSCAI. We're here today to discuss an important paper published in JSCAI titled High Definition Intravascular Ultrasound and Optical Coherence Tomography, Lumen and Plaque Morphology. I'm joined by a very great and esteemed panel of leaders and experts. We have Dr. Yiannis Chatzizisis, which is the leading author of this paper and professor and chief of the Division of Cardiovascular Medicine and the director of the Center for Digital Cardiovascular Innovations of the University of Miami. Dr. Tom Johnson, assistant professor of cardiology and honorary consultant cardiology from Bristol Heart Institute in the UK. Evan Shlofmitz, director of intravascular imaging at St. Francis Hospital in New York. And Dr. Natalia Pinilla, associate professor and director of advanced coronary imaging fellowship at McMaster University in Canada. With no further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Chatzizisis to briefly summarize the key points of this paper. Yiannis, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel, and always very excited to be online or in person with great friends like the panel today and the broader SCAI audience. Thank you for the opportunity, the invitation to present our paper and discuss it. And of course, a big thank you to the editors of the JSCAI for publishing this work. I was humbled to be together with esteemed colleagues from the US and Europe in this paper, where we compared essentially in terms of lumen size and morphology head-to-head the latest high-definition IVUS technology available and widely available and the latest OCT technology widely available. I'm going to start with my disclosures. And as I said, the objective was, obviously the field is evolving. Every day a new variation of IVUS or OCT is coming into play, but more or less the most widely available technologies right now is from the HD IVUS standpoint is the AVVIGO system, the latest by Boston Scientific, and then from the OCT standpoint, the Ultron 2.0 by Abbott. So we essentially compared those two latest HD IVUS and OCT widely available systems in terms of their morphology, performance for morphology and lumen size, using silicon models first and micro CT as ground truth to secure a very objective ground truth. And of course, head-to-head in clinical cases. And in that case, obviously, there was no true ground truth. A graphical presentation of the methods again, as I said, in 8 silicon models. We scanned them of varying size, all the way from 2 to 6 millimeters, so varying size. We scanned each model, each silicon model with HD IVUS AVVIGO Plus, then OCT Ultron 2.0, and then all these models underwent micro CT to establish the ground truth. And we compared head-to-head the HD IVUS AVVIGO with the Ultron 2.0 OCT in terms of lumen size. And then for clinical cases, we got 12 arteries from 9 patients, 12 coronary arteries. The majority of those were scanned, were imaged with the older version of HD IVUS, the Polaris, and AptiView Optis OCT, and then 3 out of those 12 arteries were imaged with AVVIGO and Ultron 2.0. So the same artery imaged with the HD IVUS and OCT back-to-back. As you can see here, the silicon model, the experimental, as we call, results show that HD IVUS, the OptiCross combined with the AVVIGO Plus system versus micro CT, shows that the lumen size in those models by HD-IVUS tends to be overestimated by 60 microns, an error of plus 1.7%. So overestimation by a little bit. When it comes to OCT with the Ultron 2.0, the difference is that OCT underestimates compared to micro-CT by 170 microns. A little thicker, like a strat is like 80 microns, so essentially 2 strats. Error minus around 5% compared OCT, comparing this to micro-CT. And that's the graphical essential representation here, that IVUS overestimates in compared to OCT to micro-CT in silicon models in a very meticulous experimental setup by a little bit the ground truth, and OCT underestimates the ground truth by around 5%. We also noticed that, as shown here, the ground truth is this is the diameter, the lumen diameter, the black triangles is the ground truth, the micro-CT. Blue dots is the measurements of the lumen by IVUS, HD-IVUS AVIGO, optic-cross and AVIGO, and then the red squares is the OCT. As you can see, IVUS consistently overestimates by a bit the ground truth, whereas OCT consistently underestimates the ground truth by a bit, and this underestimation is more pronounced as the diameters get bigger. So you see in smaller diameters below 3.0, it's relatively smaller, and as we go up to 6.0, the underestimation of the true lumen by OCT is more pronounced. And that essentially summarizes the experimental results. Then we move to the coronary arteries, the in vivo part of the study, where we found, as you can see here, this is comparison of the lumen of coronary arteries, real arteries, of HD Polaris versus the OCT. So the previous versions of both HD-IVUS and OCT, yielding an average difference, IVUS plus 260 microns compared to OCT. So overestimation essentially compared to OCT, if OCT is the ground truth. And this difference between IVUS and OCT converges to half, from 260 to around 120 with the newest system. So it seems that the newest systems, the AVIGO and the Ultron, tend to converge closer to each other compared to the previous versions. And qualitatively, as you can see here, very nicely, we compared head-to-head, same exactly plaques imaged with OCT and IVUS. And very interestingly, when it comes to thin cap fibroadenoma, the ability to visualize the thin cap, an old necrotic core here, and a new fibrous cap, and a ruptured and healed new fibrous cap on top of the old necrotic core, a thick cap fibroadenoma with thick fibrous cap and lipid core, the calcium arc. The depth obviously cannot be visualized because of the shadow by imaging, by IVUS. Dissection as well, and then of course stent strats. Obviously the OCT is always the ground truth, but it seems that HD-IVUS, when it comes to imaging of fine structures like the thin cap, like strats, like a dissection, is getting now closer to OCT. Also very closer when it comes to quantitative measurements, as I showed to you in the previous slide. So the gap between OCT and HD-IVUS qualitatively and quantitatively appears to get closer. So take-home messages: the latest widely available HD-IVUS technology tends to overestimate the lumen size, whereas the OCT tends to underestimate it. Our experimental silicon-based data show that HD-IVUS is more accurate compared to OCT, using a very solid ground truth. The latest HD-IVUS, the AVIGO, optic-cross and AVIGO. Obviously, we cannot extrapolate this to clinical setup, but if we could, of course, in the clinical setting, there's no ground truth, but it seems that maybe there's a potential trend favoring more accurate measurements of the lumen with HD-IVUS compared to OCT. particularly in large coronary arteries. That's something that obviously remains to be further studied, but it's some that can be extrapolated from the experimental data. And then, of course, the gap is bridged between HD-IVUS and OCT. Now the differences appear to be less pronounced compared to the previous technologies. And I'm sure the technology keeps evolving and they're going to be closer and closer to the reality. So maybe the concept, this convergence, maybe the concept now of using different criteria for the true lumen, using IVUS or OCT maybe has to change to a single, essentially, kind of like measurement, which is going to be reliable and most likely representative of the reality, regardless of HD-IVUS or OCT. Again, the funding was coming for this from different federal philanthropy and industry resources. That was not funded by Boston Scientific, this particular study, obviously. And a big thank you to my group here, who worked very hard on this paper. And thank you again for the invitation to present this work. And now it's open to some nice discussion.
Thank you, Yiannis. That was great. Let me start the discussion. And let me ask Tom a question about, the traditional thinking was always that OCT was more accurate to the phantom, and while I was always consistently overestimating lumen dimensions by around 10%. Yiannis now showed that HD-IVUS kind of closed the gap, and pretty much both modalities are very accurate. Although, with a little bit of over or underestimation of lumen dimensions, we're much closer to the reality than we were in the past. How do you think these improvements will affect the way we practice or affect the way people are using intravascular imaging, with the hope that we get more confidence in the measurements we get, and hopefully more adoption of intravascular imaging?
There are a lot of questions to unpack there, potentially, Daniel, but I think focusing on the issue of how HD-IVUS, and I think specifically within this study, the software of Vigo has made a difference. I think we highlight that now that we're making more accurate measurements according to this ground truth that Yiannis has demonstrated with micro CT. I think from a clinical perspective, the most important element there is in having confidence in the imaging and potentially the measurements that you make. And I think the radical shift that has occurred, both with the adoption of a higher resolution, high definition IVUS, but then, as I've said, the focus within this study regarding the software is that there is more reliable assessment and delineation of both the lumen and the external elastic membrane. So I think, regardless of the comparisons between OCT and IVUS, I think specifically focusing on the IVUS, we're now in a position, if you have available both the high definition IVUS and the software, to have much more reliable and immediate measurements. And I think if we compare that with OCT, due to the higher resolution of OCT, we have always really had very reliable or accurate delineation, particularly of the lumen. But obviously one of the issues is that with attenuation of the light into deeper structures, if we have significant disease, we may not have evidence of the deeper wall structures, and particularly the external elastic membrane. So for me, really, the focus on this is just the accuracy has improved, and we now have two modalities, both OCT and IVUS, that are incredibly accurate in the measurements that they make.
That's great. So, Evan, there was a lot of comments about it's not probably only the catheter, but the software. Yiannis mentioned about, the new generation of Vigo Plus kind of closed the gap, and Tom also mentioned about the use of the new Vigo Plus. Can you kind of explain the audience what is Vigo Plus introducing to the interventional community? What are the advances that we have in this new generation software?
Thanks. And, I think Vigo Plus brought a huge innovation that really was a paradigm shift. The whole purpose of intracoronary imaging is to get objective data, move away from the subjective eyeballing. It looks like a 3.0 vessel, looks like a 70% blockage. And we want objective information. And if you think of that shift from the way IVUS was largely used clinically of eyeballing, making sure there's no gross abnormality, there was this major change with OCT. We had very clear objective information. There was a definite MSA, or minimal stent area. And whether I was looking at it or Natalia was looking at the image in a different country, we can both look at the same OCT pullback, and we're both going to show you exactly where the MSA is at the exact same cross-section and come up with the exact same value. And that objective info was really a huge step forward. With IVUS, though, historically, we would just go through the pullback and we'd find what looks to be the smallest and make those manual measurements. And there'd be some discordance between each of us on this panel if we looked at the same IVUS. And what Boston was the first to really do with the IVUS, they automated this, where using AI, it will automate the measurements with the Vigo Plus. So now, the same as you get with OCT, we're all going to come up with the same exact area where there's the minimum lumen area or minimal stent area. And what's good, this helps the reproducible data. So I think it helps clinically with more accurate information. But importantly, I think it helps to overcome a lot of that learning curve and fear why people don't use intracoronary imaging. It's mostly this learning curve of people are afraid they don't know what they're looking at. And one of the best things to do in practice, if you have the AI, you can work your way through how to approach a case and how to analyze a case, and you have that AI in the software to check your work against, essentially. So Vigo Plus was a huge step forward with IVUS. With Ultron 2.0, that's the latest from Abbott's OCT. But what's important to keep in mind, as companies continue to introduce this new technology, we need to validate it clinically. And big kudos to Yiannis and the team for leading this effort. We want to keep validating this and make sure, as there's these improvements, it's clinically accurate. And that's what I think the study showed. We're getting into the nitty-gritty of where there's errors from the ground truth. But if you think about, like with IVUS, the 0.1 millimeter, clinically, it's not really that meaningful. What we typically do, we round up or round down our measurements anyway to the next available stent size. So that's all absorbed in that margin of error. So this is extremely accurate. And this is going to continue to improve over the next year. Boston will likely introduce their next version of a Vigo Plus. Abbott's going to introduce their next version, Ultron 3. There's been a new catheter that's introduced with Abbott with the OpStar catheter, potentially helping to close that gap with improving the accuracy. So I think we're headed in the right direction with all these software improvements.
Yeah, no, that's great. And automation in the cath lab is key, right? So no eyeballing, precise measurements, and fast identification. So Natalia, you have done a lot of analysis of, ACS cases and plaque morphology. How do you integrate this precision in lumen measurement with all these, nice fine structure elements that Yiannis showed us?
Yeah, that's a good question because in this study, we're basically seeing that the a high-definition IVUS got very close to what we get with OCT. So in the past, there were a lot of fears that with IVUS, we wouldn't be able to define the luminal structures, which here we are seeing that we get a very, very close to the findings we get with OCT. So I think the message is, as we have discussed, as the imaging modalities improve, I think the ideal scenario is that now we are getting compatible information, accurate information with both modalities. And we all here in this conversation, we have very good understanding of both technologies. We have both technologies available. What if you don't? I think this reinforces our colleagues to use either and feel very comfortable with both, because with both modalities, you could achieve a good assessment of the vessel, not only dimensions, but luminal findings. So I think that's very important. However, as the paper points out, the larger the vessel is, then IVUS has a higher implementation in those vessels. And in Lumen, as nicely the illustrations of this paper, if you have an interest in thin cath, fibrous cath, stent struts findings, or all of those ones, maybe OCT shows them more clear than the IVUS. But again, I think the big message is like both are comparable, both are accurate, and we are able to define a chronic course fibrous lipid, necrotic course with both modalities. So I think this is a very important message that both modalities give us a very good and comparable information. And with both, we will get a good job done in the cath lab.
Oh, that's great. And I think, the final message is that, we're getting more accurate tools. We're getting better softwares with full automation and objective data presented to the operators. And I hope that these all in combination can improve the use of intravascular imaging in general, right? So whatever modality you're using, just use it more, make precision medicine instead of eyeballing medicine. And Yiannis, thank you so much, and congratulations on this very nice paper. And thank you all for joining us at JSCAI's in conversation.
Thank you for having us here, and always great to see you guys. Thank you.